Good evening, everyone. Happy Monday. Thank you all for joining today's panel discussion. My name is Ahmad Watson, and I am a program coordinator here at the Joseph C. Cornwall Center for Metropolitan Studies at Rutgers Newark. I want to say thank you all today for allowing me to do the opening remarks. Today's panel discussion is titled Carter G. Woodson, African American Teachers and Pedagogies of Liberation, a conversation with James Anderson and Jarvis Givens. Just want to give you a little bit of background information about this virtual series. So this event is sponsored by the Freedom School Project, an attempt to change the national conversation about education for the children of disenfranchised communities. We advocate re-engineering some schools in such communities based on the principles underlying Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, Freedom Schools, and similar efforts. Today's panel discussion is going to actually be our last panel discussion until September. And I would like to let you all know that today's panel discussion will also be recorded. At this time, I want to say thank you for allowing me to introduce you all. And I'm going to pass it over to Charles Payne, Director of the Joseph C. Cornwall Center for Metropolitan Studies.
Thank you, Ahmad. Thanks for the introduction. Thank everybody who is online tonight. We've had a very enthusiastic response to this event. And I will say an enthusiastic response to the series going back to November, I think. We've gotten many remarks from people who thought they found something useful, inspiring, hopeful about the kinds of conversations we've been able to have with one another over the last several months. So I have a happy job tonight. I get to introduce two of my favorite scholars and two of my favorite people. Those two things don't always go together. James Anderson, Dean of the College of Education, Edward and William Jane Margutsell, Professor of Education, Affiliate Professor of History, African American Studies, and the College of Law at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His book, his famous book, The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935, won the American Educational Research Association Outstanding Book Award in 1999. Now, hold that fact, right? He won the AERA Outstanding Book Award in 1999. Just hold on to that for a second. That book, as far as I'm concerned, it's one of the most important books on American education ever written. You simply cannot understand the core aspirations of African Americans as a people unless you've read that book. Jim, his stature as a scholar is unquestioned, a member of the National Academy of Education, American Academy of Arts and Sciences, American Educational Research Association in 1920 awarded him its presidential citation. So, okay, he's a scholar, right? What you really need to know, what you really need to know if you want to know how to deal with Mr. Anderson, is that he is in the Stillman College Educator Hall of Fame. But that's what's really important about Jim, right? Let me tell you this. Just a month ago, we were both at AERA, and his students, at least 30 years of people he has taught, came together and they sponsored a session that was about Jim and his mentoring for them. There were easily 100 people in that room, right? They're college faculty, researchers, deans, public school teachers, and it was all, they came back to say thanks for the mentoring he had given them, thanks for the teaching he had given them, thanks for what he and Bill Trent, his partner in crime, what they had done to shape at the University of Illinois a space in which large numbers of Black and Brown students were being set on a path to strong professional careers. And I realized when I was watching and hearing all of the jokes about Stillman College back and forth, right? And essentially what Jim has done was he recreated Stillman College at the University of Illinois, right? He's created a part of the University of Illinois, he and Trent, that has the best ethos of the Black college tradition, of education as communal tradition, of one generation's responsibility to the next generation. And he's created that kind of Black college ethos, that kind of Stillman ethos. He's created that inside a major Research One university, and he did it all with University of Illinois money. Okay. So why he is not in jail, I don't know. He may wish to speak about that later. So Jim, now Jarvis Givens, assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, also faculty affiliate in the Department of African American Studies at Harvard, co-editor of the book We Dare Say Love, supporting achievement in the educational life of Black boys. He is also building, some people ask him to talk about later, the Black Teacher Archive, an online portal that will hold records of the colored teachers associations that I'm sure we will be talking about today. I think it is also very significant that he is an officer in the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, the organization that was started by Carter G. Woodson, one of the organizations started by Carter G. Woodson. Most particularly, his new book, which is causing all kinds of waves and generating all kinds of positive discussions around the country. Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching. Published last year, it has won the 2022 Association of African American Life and Association for the Study of African American Life and History. It's won their book prize for Best New Book in African American History and Culture, and he has won the 2022 Outstanding Book Award from the American Educational Research Association, same award that Jim won 30 years ago. So their thinking has crossed in that respect. But all apart from the plaudits for the book, the really enthusiastic reception it has received every place, in terms of its theoretical sophistication, in terms of its ability, in terms of the depth of its research. But what I have found most satisfying, I think is the word I want. What I found most satisfying about the way the book is being received is it's causing Black people to look differently at themselves and their own possibilities. That is just a hell of an achievement, right? But it's causing us to look back at our own educational tradition and say, yes, we have some educational traditions, right? We can think about how those things can be used now, which is a question I'm sure we'll come to later. So I will just say thanks to both of our guests. It's a wonderful pairing to have them and to have both of them take time from their schedules out to do this. We are very grateful for that. So first, I think I will just ask both of you, it's not accidental that you do what you do. I mean, you came along certain educational paths that made you into certain kinds of educational scholars, asking certain kinds of questions. So I'm just going to say something, ask you to say something about how your own educational journey brought you to doing the kind of work that you do. Jarvis, would you start? How do you get from Compton to where you are now, doing what you're doing now?
Yeah, thanks for that generous introduction. And again, thanks. I appreciate it, Professor Payne, for pulling us together to be in conversation, because I feel like we have a lot to talk about. But I'm just really grateful to be able to be in dialogue with all of you that are here today, but particularly yourself and Professor Anderson, to talk about my book, but the larger body of scholarship that my book is a part of, and the larger tradition that it's a part of. And I appreciate the question, because in many ways it allows me to say something that's kind of like the backstory to me writing the book. When I got to college in 2006 as a freshman at UC Berkeley, it wasn't a lot of Black students at Berkeley. It was around 3.25%. But among those of us that were Black students at the school, I quickly realized that I had a very different educational trajectory. A lot of my classmates that were at Berkeley came from schools that were not predominantly Black, or if they were predominantly Black, did not have majority Black teachers. And that's something I became aware of very early on, is that the fact that I went to schools in Compton, California, my entire life from preschool through 8th grade, where I was majority Black students and majority Black teachers. It wasn't anything that I knew to appreciate until I got to college and realized that was something that was very different. I attended a small Black parochial school from preschool through 8th grade. That was initially an all-white school. It was Episcopalian all-white school when Compton was all white, right? A lot of people are shocked to learn that, but then you have white flight, you have Black folks that moved into the city and appropriated this school that was called St. Timothy's. And the principal who was at the school when I got there was one of the early Black teachers that started when the school was making that transition, who was a graduate from Southern University, who started teaching at the Southern University Laboratory School. She herself was educated in Lake Providence, Louisiana, grew up as a sharecropper, and came from a family of farmers, but attended all Black schools. And in many ways, by the time I got to the school in the 1990s, I was at a school with all Black teachers, all Black students. Before we even entered the classroom every morning, we began by lining up to sing, lift every voice and sing, to recite poems like Dreams by Langston Hughes. Every day before I started the school day, from the time I was in preschool until I graduated 8th grade, that was the daily ritual that I did until I went to high school at King Drew High School, which was also a high achieving Black school in Watts. It was a public school that was founded by, it was a magnet school created from a group of community organizers well before I was born, but majority Black administrators and majority Black teachers and veteran Black teachers as well, many who were also Southern migrants, I would come to learn once I graduated from college and started to delve a little deeper. But I share that to say is that when I went to college, I had this experience that made me feel like I was very much always connected to a tradition of educational achievement among Black folks, right? And then I got to college and encountered all of this literature about Black student underachievement, the school to prison pipeline, and all these sorts of things that a lot of professors, a lot of classmates were expecting me to be very familiar with. And I didn't find those narratives to be familiar because it wasn't the narrative that I understood. I attended high achieving Black schools in Compton my entire life. And there were 11 of my classmates that started at UC Berkeley at our freshman year together. And when I got to graduate school and I started to, I was in a class when I was in graduate school. This is, fast forwarding a bit, it was a seminar I took with Naila Nasir and Janelle Scott. And one of the books that was on the reading list was Professor James Anderson, The Education of Blacks in the South, which was one of the first texts that we read. And I thought, this is really important. It was giving me a much broader and much more nuanced context to think about this early history of Black education. But it was when I was able to read Vanessa Siddle Walker's work right after James Anderson that I think complemented that text in so many ways. It offered this kind of specific case study of this on the ground story of a school that fit into this larger structural and institutional narrative that was painted in the education of Blacks in the South, that helped me realize that there was this much more complicated story of Black education prior to desegregation it helped me place the educational experiences that I had into context. And that led to a number of questions with me going back and interviewing some of my earlier teachers. I remember the paper I wrote for that class was me conducting oral histories with some of my former teachers, learning that they were from, Hot Springs, Arkansas, from Grenada, Mississippi, from various parts of North Carolina, from Lake Providence, Louisiana. And I started to understand that the education that I had was a part of this migration narrative of Black pedagogical traditions that was rare in the community that I was, growing up in, but it wasn't a tradition that fell out of nowhere, right? And so that became the beginning of my journey, trying to delve a little deeper and to figure out how to make sense of this world of Black education that, for me, I felt like I was encountering for the very first time, even though it seemed so familiar when I was reading Professor Anderson's book and Professor Siddle Walker's book.
Jarvis, would you add one thing? Would you say something about one of your high school teachers, Miss Hutchinson?
Right. Yeah. So Miss Hutchinson was one of my high school English teachers at the high school that I attended. But she, began her education in Hot Springs, Arkansas, at the Frederick Douglass School, I should say, named after Frederick Douglass, the fugitive slave, abolitionist, important political thinker. But then before she got to high school, she actually migrated to California, had terrible experiences in the context of California, very few Black teachers. But she would, immediately after she graduated from college at Cal State Long Beach, she knew early on that she wanted to be a teacher because of those early educators that she had in Arkansas, that she kind of held on to those memories as she was navigating the schools in California, until she herself became a teacher and was able to kind of embody the pedagogical practices that inspired her very early on to become an educator. And she had a very important role in shaping the intellectual culture at the high school that I attended in Watts, which was a public high school, because she was the chair of the English department, right? She was my AP English literature teacher, but she would have these like annual reading marathons at her home every year, some from the 1980s until the time I was her student in the early 2000s. And she was a very engaged and active teacher, not just in terms of teaching what was required of her, but in terms of working to kind of create a culture of achievement at the school that I went to and that I benefited from, because she was really, modeling a pedagogical tradition that's not a pedagogical tradition she learned at Cal State Long Beach in the teacher training program there. She would be the first to tell you that's not where she got it from, but it was because she was, she began teaching right after the Watts uprising, but her pedagogy was informed by a political orientation to the work that she was doing and a political clarity about what education was supposed to be doing in the lives of Black students in the context in which she lived. In this particular case was Watts, even though she had a personal intellectual and educational history that began before she came to Watts and went to Compton High School, where white students protested and the Black students that when she was integrating the school, writing "No Nigger for Queen" when the first Black prom queen was elected when she was a student there, right? As she watched the desegregation of Central High School when she was a student in California, back in Arkansas, remembering this and her navigating this really important kind of historical terrain, even though she never explained any of that in our classroom, it started to make perfect sense when I got to know more about her educational journey, to say this education, this pedagogical tradition that I benefited from was not just about this individual teacher, but it was this individual teacher who was channeling and working to build on something that she understood to be good teaching and important education for Black students, because she herself was could attest to that.
Okay, that's great. Jim, would you do the same? Would you say something about your educational journey?
Yeah, it's not something that I've talked about over the course of my career. It's a sacred part of me, and it means a lot. It's always fueled me throughout my life. I was born in a household with a single parent, a mother and a grandmother, and 4 brothers. My grandmother was completely illiterate. She could neither read nor write. And my mother, she had gone to school and she finished the 9th grade at a time when the county only allowed 9th grade for African-American students. And after she finished the 9th grade, they added the other 3 grades later. And she tried to go back and finish. She got up to the 11th, but by that time she was married with kids. And so that as far as she got. I didn't have any preschool. In fact, there were no preschools for African-American students in my hometown. I do remember this one little school, because I would pass by it on the way to my cousin's house, and I would see these 2 or 3 kids in there and wonder what they were doing. I now look back and realize that it was kindergarten or something like that. But this was for kids who were really the kids of teachers and ministers. But for most of it, in fact, for all the kids in my community, there was no preschool. So I arrived at age 5 in the 1st grade for the first time for formal education. And I do remember Mrs. Howard, my 1st grade teacher. In fact, I remember every one of my teachers in every grade and the distinctive impact that they had on me. And she looked like she'd been cut out of a magazine. She was so well dressed, stern. She wasn't really smiling at us. But I do recall thinking that if I learned what she was trying to teach me, to read, mathematics, calculate, to spell, if I did all these things, that she would have more approval of me. She would have more respect for me, that somehow I was so impressed by her that I thought learning from her would impress her in terms of my personhood, that it would simply say to her that I am somebody, and I do understand. And so I started, responding to my teachers in the first grade, always had nothing but respect. We went to school where it was 12 grades. So you started 1 and went all the way through to high school. There was no separation between elementary, junior high, and secondary. And so I went through that whole system, and all of those teachers. In fact, there's one that I'm going to call either this week or pretty soon, because he was my homeroom teacher in the 12th grade, Mr. Hughes, now Dr. Herman Hughes. He was my math teacher at the time, and he went on to be professor of mathematics at Michigan State University. And I thought at the time that he was brilliant, and I really did love responding, doing my best to keep up with what he was assigning us. But I came from a community where I did not know of anyone in my community, not just in my family, in my community who'd gone to college. And my brother, who was 1 year ahead of me, his class graduated the year before, and nobody in his class went to college, zero. And so that was the fate that I saw for myself. I was headed in the same direction. Now, it had nothing to do with the achievement of the students. As a matter of fact, it turned out in my senior year, I was class valedictorian. So it wasn't because I wasn't achieving. It was because it wasn't tradition. It wasn't something that happened to people like me. There was no one in my family, no one in my community. So there was no expectation that I would go to college. So the reason I'm calling him was that on commencement day, he came and called me out of line, which scared me to death, because when I went to high school, if they called you out of line on commencement day, that meant you probably weren't going to graduate. And it didn't have to be for academics. It could be for social reasons, it could be for ethical reasons, because if they didn't think that you were the kind of students that they'd be proud to have as a graduate of Carver High School, we were named after George Washington Carver, then they would pull you and call you back for another year. That happened to my cousin, who was also in the 12th grade with me. He had to do a whole nother year because of behavior, not because of academics. But at any rate, he called me to his classroom. It was quite near the assembly hall or the gym where we was gonna have our commencement. So I went in there with him, and he said, I have to tell you before you make your speech, because before you get to do your valedictorian speech, and by the way, we had to do it from memory. You could not read anything. The whole speech had to be done completely from memory. And so he knew the challenge, and he said, they're going to announce that you have a scholarship to Stillman College. And even today, and I just looked at him. I was like, what? And he said, you need to know, because I don't want you to forget your speech. But that's going to be announced. He had gone to Stillman College and talked to the dean of Stillman College and told the dean that I was worthy of a scholarship. And it was done so late in the game that they handed me a piece of paper with a handwritten note from Dean Hardy at Stillman College that I had a scholarship to go to Stillman. And it completely changed the course of my life. I went to Stillman, he had gone to Stillman. I excelled at Stillman. I was, president of the sophomore class, president of the junior class, president of the senior class. I did all kinds of things and was surrounded by great teachers and, had mentors today that I'm still in touch with. And so by that time, by the time I finished Carver High School, and by the time I got through Stillman, I realized I am who I became who I am today. I mean, going on to graduate school was a wonderful opportunity, being able to excel at Illinois and to get a PhD. But when I look at my own education journey, I think about those teachers who just brought me through that dark path when there was no hope and no dreams and no opportunity. And somehow I realized, and the reason is still that he didn't have to do that. That was not an obligation that he had. I mean, he had been my math teacher. I'd excelled in math. I actually went to Stillman and majored in mathematics the first 2 years because of him. And then while I was there, I got involved in civil rights demonstrations, the whole civil rights movement and things like that, and started to think more about social relations and ended up majoring in sociology and went on to graduate school in education. But it was, you know, that's why I'm so grateful to Jarvis, because he is writing about our teachers and exploring dimensions of them that have been untold, uncovered. And you know, I think for me, it's been so sacred and so close to me that I've kind of almost stayed away from it in a way. It's an extremely emotional journey for me.
One, I want to thank you for sharing, for being so honest. And I want to thank you for introducing the idea that there's something sacred about the kind of discussion that we're having. That's just the right language for talking about this. Just two things before we go on. One, I neglected to say that those of you, and some folk already have their hands up, we're going to be talking maybe another 20 or so minutes among ourselves, the three of us. Then after that, we'll throw it open to the world. And so if you have any questions, just put them in the chat. I mean, we already have a couple that folks sent in ahead of time, right? But just put your questions in the chat. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible today. Second, I hadn't planned to say anything about my own background, but I just want to say something about places of resonance. I mean, I grew up in New Jersey, and people don't realize that before my time, up until either 48 or the early 50s, depending on how you want to count it, New Jersey had legal school segregation, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's the kind of system that my father went to. His teacher principal, the person who ran the colored annex in Cape May, New Jersey for about 50 years, a man named William Moore. We're about to celebrate his 150th birthday this July. In fact, I'm going to try to get Nikki to post the flyer for it, because I'll never get it into the chat, just so that you can see what the children look like. A Howard University graduate, had many offers to teach in the South, but he wanted the freedom to teach Black children someplace where he could make up the curriculum unmolested, right? And he was interested in John Dewey's ideas, so he wanted to do a kind of progressive Black public school in a village of people who were largely domestics, day laborers, an extremely poor community. He created such a powerful sense of education that, you know, Black folk from Cape May and his generation have a reputation for arrogance. They think they're smarter than everybody, Black and white, right? And in fact, it was universally assumed among my father's cohort that they were better educated than the white kids from the same town. And it may well have been true. I think there was a story, parts of which I have validated, that there was a time they went to segregated elementary schools, and they went to integrated high school. There were 3 years in a row in which the valedictorians at the high school were Black students coming from Mr. Moore's classes, right? The next year, they didn't have any valedictorian. They got rid of the roll. That's New Jersey for you, right? But I just want to say that there's this notion of somebody who wanted to hold Black students to high standards, who had a sense of their unlimited possibilities, who recognized one of the reasons my father caught my mother's eye was that he knew the Black Negro national anthem, and she had no idea there was such a thing, right? But you know, Mr. Moore's students were steeped in that kind of history. He came out of that kind of tradition. So anyway,
say something that happened to me at Spillman in terms of the professors there. This was my freshman year. I was a math major and had done well, of course, my freshman year. And at the end, and this says something about Black educators and the things that they would do that I've not seen done in other places. Don't think they would dare do this, but we finished our freshman year. Dean Hardy called an assembly of the whole freshman class. We got to the assembly and we saw these boxes and we knew we'd done well. And we thought they were gifts or something. So he got up and he said, there are things in the boxes for you, but first let me explain. He said, as a class, you've done well in your math courses, your biology courses, your chemistry courses, and so forth. But we don't think your literary knowledge is where it should be. So in those boxes are 4 books that you all must read over the summer. And I recall there was Profiles in Courage, John Steinbeck's The Pearl, Catching the Rye. I still don't understand that book today. and Lord of the Flies, mostly Pulitzer Prize winning books. And then he said, now when you come back at the fall of your sophomore year, we're going to give you an exam. And if you don't pass the exam, we're not going to allow you to enroll. All right. So you can imagine how we read those books over the summer. We got back in the fall. That was all the trick. It had nothing to do with whether he didn't even raise questions about it, but we all had read these books from cover to cover, right? And then we began to talk to each other. Even though we were in math or chemistry, whatever you made, you're not talking about literary matters, books and so forth, and the meaning of the Pearl or Profiles in Courage. For them to take notice of our complete education. Jarvis writes about that in his work as well. For them to understand that it's much more than being expert in your subject matter. You know, it's really about, and what they meant by literary knowledge, it's really about your liberation. It's about your consciousness. And so, again, you know, it's like, I couldn't even imagine that happened to a place like Illinois. You know, it would be, I mean, people have their lawyers out, right? You mean my son or daughter has made A's in their major, and now you're going to put this requirement, and you're going to dare say they can't enroll? Well, I went to a small Black college, and that's the kind of control and influence they had, and I'm sure behind the scene they were laughing because they knew how well we read those books. They read these books more so than any other things. But again, you look back and you appreciate that kind of education because you appreciate what they thought of you, what they expected of you, and what they were pushing you to be.
And their investment in you as a whole person.
Yeah.
Not as a person who knows math or knows biology, but as a moral person, as a thinking person, as an intellectual person.
Yeah.
The totality of your development, they feel responsible for. Mm-hmm. That is special and too rare. But the audiences that we have for these talks have come from very varied backgrounds. So I don't want to make too many assumptions about who knows what. So at least a couple of things I would like to make sure are shared among the audience. Jarvis, I was going to ask you just to say something, since Carter G. Woodson is so central to this conversation and to your work, just to help us place Carter G. Woodson, right? Mm-hmm. Who he was, some of the things he started, just where he fits in the Black educational practice. And then Jim, I was going to ask you, one of the things that from your book where I can still doggone their quote paragraphs is that discussion of the role that Black people play in creating educational systems in the South. And again, I think that's foundational. I'd like you to say something about that. But Jarvis, would you start?
Yeah, and actually, if it's okay, I'm gonna just share a quick slide to give a little context because since you're asking me to talk about Woodson, I wanted to share a little bit of the background, like story in terms of how I came to think about Woodson, not just as an intellectual and as the father of Black history, but I remember being so shocked during my second year of graduate school when I learned not just about Negro History Week, but that Carter G. Woodson actually wrote textbooks for school teachers that were widely circulated among Black educators. The image you see on the screen, one is of a group of junior high students in New Orleans, and I believe this is 1935. But you know, it wasn't just that Carter G. Woodson published these school textbooks, but it also had to, for me, it was just shocking to learn about the wide circulation of these materials, because in so many ways, this intellectual tradition really complicated the image that I had in my mind from popular representations of Black education before Brown, right, that are framed by the narrative of separate and unequal that was important to prove. And, you know, a part of the litigation strategy for Brown was kind of read over the entire history leading up to that moment, to where, for me, like thinking about Carter G. Woodson writing these textbooks and them not only circulating in New Orleans, but also, you know, I remember reading one of the kind of cards in the late 1920s where the Bordentown School in New Jersey was also one of the first early schools to adopt Woodson's textbook, right? But also, you know, Black teachers really across the South, but also in these kind of various different pockets in various northern states as well, right? We could think about Madeline Morgan in Chicago also being a part of this network. And so for me, one of the things that became really important was for me to delve more into Woodson as more than just a historian, but to know that he was first and foremost a school teacher, right? Woodson was the child and the student of formerly enslaved people. He was born in 1875, and his first teachers were his formerly enslaved uncles, who taught him in a one-room schoolhouse, beginning in Virginia, but then he goes to West Virginia where he's working in the coal mines among a group of illiterate Black Civil War veterans and formerly enslaved men who would ask for him to come in the evenings to read to them, right? So in many ways, this group of adult Black men who he was working alongside in the coal mines as he's a teenager were really his first students, asking him to engage in this practice of communal literacy, to read from Black newspapers, to read from Black books that had been published during the time period. But then he also talked about how these formerly enslaved men would speak back to the text that he would read to them. And he came to realize that these people, like similar to his father, who would also require him to read from the newspapers to him, but that these people were also repositories of knowledge, who had very important histories, and that whose stories and history complicated so much of the kind of narratives that he would encounter later on when he would go to Berea College and then the University of Chicago before becoming the second Black person to get a PhD from Harvard, right? But the entire time that he's a student, from the time he's at Berea in the late, you know, he graduates high school in 1896, the same month of, you know, that Plessy versus Ferguson is ruled on, right? And within the first year when he starts school at Berea, he starts becoming a student part-time because he's also teaching to support himself through his education, right? And he's primarily doing his education at Berea through correspondence courses, but he's teaching at Black schools in West Virginia. And then, you know, he goes on to become a teacher at the M Street School before it becomes Dunbar High School, where he's, you know, when he moves to Washington, D.C., after his first year as a PhD student at Harvard, it's not just that he's a teacher, but he's a teacher within this kind of intellectual world of where you have folks like Anna Julia Cooper, right? Where you have folks like, you know, so many of the educators in Washington, D.C. schools during this time period who are very important intellectuals, right? Beyond just the practical aspects of what it meant to be a teacher during that time period. Woodson also became deeply ingrained in this networked world where you have these teachers operating as intellectuals as well, right? He wouldn't be the only person at the M Street School with a PhD. And I think that that's very important to emphasize, is that before he completes his PhD in 1912, before he founds ASALH in 1915, and then the Negro History Week, and before he publishes all these textbooks, he's a part of this very sophisticated intellectual world in this counter public of Black teachers. And that's really important to know when it comes to Carter G. Woodson, is that we have to think of him as more than just a historian, but that he was first and foremost a school teacher. And the work that he did as a historian was deeply informed by his orientation to the world as the child and student of formerly enslaved people, right? Where his uncles were his first teachers, and formerly enslaved men, where the principal of his high school, the Frederick Douglass School, was his cousin, who he shared a name with, Carter Barnett, who was fired as a teacher because he ran a local Black newspaper where, Carter Barnett tried to organize the local Black community in Huntington, West Virginia, to run an independent slate of Black candidates and, leading up to the year 1900. And then he's fired by the white school board because of his political organizing, right? So Woodson witnessed this kind of intellectual surveillance of Black teachers, right? Because he was really raised up in that tradition, but also this intimate connection to it when we think about his own family history, that would inform the teacher that he became, right? So he's the person that founded Black History Month, but I always make it a point to say we have to understand who he was as a teacher to understand these textbooks that he would publish, where we see this important, these radical elements of Black history that he included in these textbooks. These are images from his first textbook published in 1922, where we see this kind of what Charles H. Wesley would call this heroic tradition in the Black intellectual tradition, where Black people recasted the fugitive slaves and these Black people who led slave revolts as folk heroes in their curricular imaginations, right? That went against the grain of the complete absence of this radical element in Black history, but also that, completely went against the distortions of Black history and culture in mainstream curricula, right? This is important. That backstory on Woodson is important to know in order for us to even appreciate, right, what he would do with his textbooks. And also we have to place in the context that he understood that there were Black teachers before him that were also doing similar things, right? People like James W.C. Pennington, who was an escaped slave, who also wrote a textbook in 1841, who was also a teacher in Connecticut, right? Woodson was very familiar with this intellectual tradition among teachers because he's seen it firsthand, but also because he studied it in the historical record. So those are just some bits and pieces of things that I feel like it's important to share in order for us to place Woodson in proper context as an educator, but also as an important intellectual figure in the Black tradition.
And to make one more personal connection to that, I had two school teacher aunts, one in Newark, one in Philadelphia, both of whom were members of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History at the time. And so it's visiting their houses that I first encountered that kind of material. Jim, could you go back to that period immediately after the Civil War and the creation of educational systems in the South and the role that Black people played in that process?
I will very quickly. I just want to say a word about
Sure.
when it used to be Negro History Week,
Uh-huh.
when I was in high school. And you go through and it's not just high school, it was all grades 1 through 12. You're going through the year and you get to this week and everything changed. Teachers became sacred in a way. The mood became sacred. I remember particularly starting with the 7th grade, and Mr. McCampbell, who taught social studies in the high school, he had a great baritone voice. And so he always would lead the assembly. We all be in the same assembly. He would sing, "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen," and "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." And it set the mood for Negro History Week. And then came the recitations of the creation, the celebrations. And it's like, all of a sudden, it wasn't school anymore. It was something very different. And it was impressed upon us that this is your sacred heritage. And you may play around with math, and you may play around with chemistry, and you may play around with English, but you do not play around with this. This is something that you need to know, you need to learn. And so I grew up with that from 1st grade right on through. And it's been extended to a month, but when it was a week, it was really, really sacred. But I want to go directly to your question, because I think it's part and parcel of the same movement. I began to notice in my study was that beginning in 1868 with military Reconstruction, and that's when African Americans first received the right to vote en masse. In fact, under military Reconstruction, there were more African Americans registered to vote in the South than whites. And so there was this massive registration under federal authorities. Didn't see that again until after 1965 with the voter registration drives under federal authority. But then you look at the constitutional conventions of 1868 in Louisiana and Mississippi and South Carolina and places like that. And all of a sudden you see an entirely different world outlook about education. One of the first things they do, because in none of those southern states did they have constitutional provisions mandated universal education. So one of the first things they do in those constitutional conventions is say, you know, put into the Constitution of South Carolina, Mississippi, of Alabama, Louisiana, you know, provisions mandate tax-supported universal education, free to all. And that meant all, not just free to Black, free to all. And that was something new and unprecedented in Southern history. But that was just the beginning. They established schools for the deaf and the blind. They established juvenile delinquency schools as well for those kids that might have run afoul of the law and regulations. They provided for taxes to support those schools. And then they went on with other things. I mean, we forget, because one of the things we celebrate in America is this tradition of land grant universities, right? I mean, by 1917 or so, 1/3 of all American students enrolled in higher education were in land grant universities. So the Michigan States, the Illinois of the world became great universities. But sometimes we forget that the Morrill Act was passed in 1862. What else was happening in 1862? The Civil War. So the South had already seceded from the Union when the Morrill Act was passed. But when African Americans were heavily represented in the Constitutional Conventions of 1868, they then called for land grants. So in South Carolina, they called for a land grant university, which ended up being Clemson, and which they were never allowed to go to. But they provided the constitutional mandate to create the land grant universities. And so we see that one, African American was registered to vote. They were heavily represented in the constitutional conventions. And then they began to change the constitutions, change the law, change even the expectations in the whole worldview about education. And when people talk about the end of Reconstruction, it did not end when they say it ended. It lasts much longer than 1877, lasted throughout the 19th century, really. But when the Southern Redeemers, that is the former slave owners and their supporters, finally took control at the beginning of the 20th century, around 1901, they did not change those laws, except to put into the Constitution racial segregation. But the laws that the African Americans have put on the book for universal education, for tax-supported education, for land grant universities, schools for the deaf and blind, for the delinquent, those things remain as the foundation of Southern constitutional law for public education. And no matter how you cut it, I mean, people they look at this outpouring, this motivation, this inspiration on the part of Black people to do all these things in behalf of education. And the early interpretation was that they were imitating the masses. And you said, no, they couldn't have been imitating them because they didn't have these laws. and you can't imitate that which did not exist. And so what we see here is the African-American view, worldview of the place of education and what it means for democratic life, what it means for the development of the community, of individuals, of opportunity, who should support it. There's a whole new view of education. And I'm not seeing anybody try to refute that, by the way. That is such a fact American history, of Southern history. What we have not done, and I hope to have more time, we have not really delved deeply into that whole process of them in those constitutional conventions, and what was happening in their communities, and how did they come up with these views about education. I have a sense of where it came from. It's, it's been there historically for a long time, but once they were in charge, politically in charge, it was one of the few times, one of the few times in American history, the only time in American history where African Americans could literally think of themselves as being in charge in those constitutional conventions. And they knew in 3 states, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina, they were the majority of the population. And with the right to vote, they look forward to controlling not just education, but the politics of the state. When we write about Reconstruction, we write about it with the backward gaze, as if what happened was bound to happen. No, it was not inevitable. When they took control in 1868, with those majorities they had every right, and they did think that this is our future. We have the right to vote. We're in the Constitutional Convention. There were African-American professors as well as African-American students at the University of South Carolina in 1868. They didn't anticipate that whites would take over and then resegregate those institutions, and in fact, pass laws that Black students could not attend. That's not how they saw the world in 1868. And so they acted on their beliefs, they acted on their values, they created different systems, and it's a tribute to them and their vision that needs to be written about in much greater detail.
And if I could just chime in really, as one point, every time I hear Professor Anderson talk about this point, it's so eye-opening in terms of how this early history of Black education is useful as a frame for thinking about important trends when it comes to retrenchment and the development of kind of African-American history writ large, right? So you see this narrative where you have, African-American folks creating universal tax-supported education for the first time, not just for themselves, but across the kind of Southern states en masse. And that's a very important narrative where you can kind of think about the kind of progress that has kind of taken place as a result of kind of Black community organizing. But that the narrative of retrenchment that we know happens after the civil rights era, right, that we're having to deal with in the current moment with a lot of the stuff in the political climate. When we go back to that moment where it's like, while before the kind of Civil War, Black anti-literacy laws kind of restricted the overwhelming majority of Black people from having access to education, right now that access is created and you have a more kind of expansive opportunity for all, not just Black people, but also poor whites for education. That very system that now has, much wider doors of opportunity would then become an instrument used to kind of reproduce the kind of racial caste system that Black folks were trying to kind of work to move beyond, right? So where you start to see not the dissolving of kind of the public education system, but the way in which this how racial segregation becomes ingrained in the structure, and you start to see the kind of reproduction of anti-Blackness at a systemic level through education, the very thing that Black people created to kind of create more opportunity, more equality, right, becomes the mechanics of law become manipulated in a particular way to kind of, reproduce social relations reminiscent of the kind of pre-Civil War era, right? And I think that that's a very important nuance to that history that Professor Anderson just offered, where we have to be very kind of, attentive students of history when we're making sense about the kind of forward progress, but then the retrenchment that always seems to kind of follow. And it kind of has to cultivate a kind of vigilance when it comes to our politics in the African-American community, but also just politics in general. This is a very important story about power. And I think in race and power in particular, I think education is one of the kind of prime examples for us to kind of look to historically in the US to understand how those things have interacted and how Black folks have kind of found themselves moving through these kind of ebbs and flows over the course of time.
No, I'm glad you said that. That was actually one of the reasons I wanted Jim to talk about that. The only thing that I would add is that the way in which the historical narrative is given to us Black people are always being given something, right? They gave us our freedom, right? And I don't, with this audience, I don't even think I have to respond to that. We don't have a space in the historical narratives that we are raised on to think about what institutions did Black people create that benefited white people. That's just not a part of the way in which the history is given to us. But here, just to go back to what you just said, create the institution, it benefits white people broadly, and then they turn it against you, which is the pattern that is going to happen over and over again. I want to go back to the 19th century since that's where we are. Tim, you wrote an article 2015, which I can't recall the title, but I think you know the one I mean. But it was about the connection between politics and education. And one of the points that I was struck by is the way in which you talk about the late 1860s and late 1960s, right? And the point in particular, and I'll find the quote in a minute. That both those moments, the country was, there were people who realized that states' rights, which is maybe the original dog whistle, I mean, it's the original way to say white supremacy, that states' rights meant the disenfranchisement of Black people in the 19th century or the 20th century, right? And that the way to respond to that was with a constitutional amendment, right? And both times that idea was right there, and both times the country just backed away from it. Is that roughly the argument that you were making?
Yeah, because it all happened. I think it was in it was 2007, I believe. That's when Teresa Perry had asked me to do lectures and at Simmons. And so one of the things I wanted to do, I realized that it was I'm thinking it was the sesquicentennial of the Dred Scott decision. And so I knew that in the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court, and they always said tainted as though it was one individual. It was a 6-3 decision. It was a Supreme Court decision that said that the Constitution did not apply to African Americans because we were not citizens and could not appeal to the Constitution of the United States. And I also knew that that Supreme Court ruling was overturned by the 14th Amendment. So those were two facts that I knew. What I didn't know was, what is the fine-grained detail here of how this happened? What were the arguments? What were the debates? So I went where I knew there would be, to the congressional record over the 14th Amendment, and just with a fine-tooth comb, went through literally thousands of pages, because that debate started in December of 1865, and it did not change and didn't reach a compromise until May of 1866. So there's a lot there. And it just changed my mind about the citizenship and enfranchisement in the following way. Even in the 1960s, we talked about the right to vote, the right to vote. And then when I went through this debate, it's not a debate about the right to vote. And that's why the 15th Amendment came through so easy, which established the right to vote. The debate over the 14th Amendment was who would control the qualifications to vote. That's a different story. The right to vote is one thing. To be qualified to vote is an entirely different matter. An inmate might have the right to vote under the 15th Amendment, but the state passed a law that says once you commit a felony, you cannot vote. In some states you can, some states you can't. How does a state say we're going to close the souls to poll Sunday and get away with it? They actually have the constitutional authority to do that, because that's what was debated. The debate in 1866 was whether we would have federal control of the qualifications to vote. And it came back again in 1960s because the Attorney General, actually acting Attorney General, Nicholas Katzenbach, people probably don't remember him, but when he dug into the disenfranchisement of Black voters throughout the South in particular, and saw that there were counties with heavily populated Black residents, up to 80% in some places. And yet not a single African-American was registered to vote. And he understood it's not about them having the right to vote. That had already been guaranteed by the 15th Amendment. It's the qualifications that were set locally and statewide that disenfranchised them. And he called for a federal amendment to the Constitution in the 1960s, where there would be very simple disqualifications, like he called for incarceration. I don't necessarily agree with that when you pay your penalty, but he called for incarceration, mental illness, and something else, like 3 simple things. Otherwise, that everybody in America would be qualified to vote under federal law. And just like in the 1866, in the debate of the 14th Amendment, again, in the 1960s, it never made it to, it just never happened. So that means what we're facing now, what Stacey Abrams and others fighting, they're fighting these voter qualifications. They're not fighting for the right to vote. That's established by the 15th Amendment. They're saying, how do we allow states to set up qualifications to vote that disenfranchise populations, target populations? In fact, the chair of the Republican Party in Florida, I still have his comments in the newspapers, he quit because he says he was tired in the meetings they were talking about disenfranchising Black voters. They were very explicit about it. And so what, and the other part of it, and I'll close with this, is that because of having the franchise under military reconstruction and having it for decades, really. I mean, in the late 1860s, the 1870s, 1880s, was not until the 1990s, particularly the conventions around 1901, that they literally disenfranchised Black voters. But for a long time, the threat of the Black vote, as well as the reality, was there. And the impact on education was absolutely remarkable. And I didn't understand that even when I wrote Education of Blacks in the South, but I was reading the book done by Horace Mann Bond, Negro Education in Alabama. And he had a fact in there that was, for me, completely counterintuitive. He says that in 1890, that African-American school children in the state of Alabama were 43% of the population, but they got 44% of the tax fund. And I was like, wait a minute. You know, I was like, you trying to tell me they were doing better in 1890 than we did in the 1960s? I mean, that just didn't make any sense to me. So I went back with data to test the case. And sure enough, he's correct. And they got that proportion of the tax fund because of the laws passed by the Black representatives in the Constitutional Conventions of 1868. When they had the power to vote, they used that power to make sure that their children were not discriminated against in things like the tax fund for education. It's only when they were disenfranchised. Now think about this, in 1890, Black children in the state of Alabama received 44% of the vote when they were 43% of the population. They were 40% of the population in 1915, and they only got 10% of the tax fund once they were disenfranchised. And it led me to believe that if you're a disenfranchised people, you cannot even hope for equality of education. And it worries me to see in Georgia and Florida and Texas and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania that America is once again on the brink of disenfranchising Black voters. What does that mean for everything else that's important to us? Yeah.
And I think it makes a lot of sense that we see, you know, a lot of the things that you're pointing out about this current moment around voter suppression happening at the same time that we have so much heated debate when it comes to the kind of question of curriculum and racial, the representations of race and the history of racial inequality in the context of curriculum. I think there's a very clear connection between those things. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that we have these two kind of wars taking place simultaneously. And I think this history, much of this history that we talked about, should be instructive for how we make sense of this moment in the relationship between education and politics more broadly in our society. I think that's a very important thing to kind of lift up.
And I think, and there are a number of people in the audience who agree with you, and so I think we have some questions to chat to go in that direction.
Okay.
Two things first, though. I just want to say I'm looking at a table that I took from Jim's article, and it's a table that gives you the percentage of people voting in black belt counties in Alabama in 1960. And so we learned that in Choctaw County, 3.8% of the black population was registered to vote, as opposed to 107% of the white population. In Hale County, 3% of the black population registered to vote, 105% of the white population. So people were apparently getting up out of their graves to vote. I mean, it's really patriotic folk you had in Alabama.
Remember this, the same people in those states, Alabama, Florida, who are crying tears about fraud in the voting process, knew that when you have 107% people registered, 110% people registered, that you have prima facie evidence of fraud. There's no way you can register more than 100% of the eligible voters. Go back to that time period and see if you had any of those people. They were alive then. Mitch McConnell and all of them, they were alive. See if you have any of them looking at those same numbers and any outcry about voter fraud, of voter corruption. They were so satisfied with the disenfranchisement. And we have to understand that what concerns them today is not voter fraud, not corruption. What concerns them is that people are voting that they simply do not want to vote.
Exactly right. Exactly right. Jarvis, I have one more question for you, and then I'm going to, for a while at least, go to some of the audience questions because we have several, I think. And the question is just, would you say something about the Colored Teachers Associations as a generic name, and then also something about the work you're doing with the Black Teachers Archive?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Colored Teacher Associations are the professional organizations that were established primarily across the southern states, but there were a number of states outside the southern states as well that had them. So for instance, New Jersey had an active Colored Teachers Association as well. But these were the kind of professional organizations that Black teachers created because, you know, the mainstream white professional organizations had kind of racial kind of clauses that restricted, you know, membership based on the lines of race. But it's also important to note that even beyond the kind of racialized exclusion, that the Black Teacher Associations function in very different ways than white teacher professional organizations did. And these counterpublics essentially of black educators are spaces where we see them organizing around important political issues, whether it has to do with salary equalization, you know, raising those sorts of questions, thinking about opportunities for teacher training and creating more opportunities for those, but also a lot of important intellectual engagement in these spaces where we see Black teachers engaging with important figures in the, you know, Black intellectual elite, folks like W.B. Du Bois, right? Carter G. Woodson, Ida B. Wells. These are folks who were members of these organizations who were sharing in these spaces their ideas that not only about teaching, but in education, but also important pressing political and social issues when it came to African-American people. So these organizations were important because they were spaces where Black educators could develop what they understood to be a meaningful educational agenda that was informed not only by the things that they were learning in traditional teacher training pathways, but also from information they were gaining and engaging with from Black scholars of that particular time period. But they were also important advocacy bases, right? Where an individual teacher was vulnerable for kind of teaching against the grain, organizing and doing you know, activist kind of work in a local context, this organization could work as an advocacy organization on behalf of teachers, but also communities, right? So when we think about the vulnerability of an individual person that could be fired, the reason these organizations were important was because they represented the kind of wide and kind of broad range interests of the collective group. And they were able to establish these agendas within these groups from the active membership of Black teachers and their connection to HBCUs as well, right? That's another important part, is that these teacher organizations were really important spaces where we see the collapsing of these prosthetic boundaries between what we typically think of about the K through 12 context in higher education, because many of these organizations were founded and sustained on the context on the campuses of HBCUs, particularly the HBCUs that were important schools for teacher training, right? If we think about someone like Harper Council Trenholm at Alabama State, in similar cases in other places as well. But that's what those organizations were. I became really interested in them because when I first started writing about Carter G. Woodson and his ideas and his textbooks, I was getting a lot of questions about, how I could demonstrate that his ideas and his textbooks and Negro History Week was as widespread as I was suggesting that it was in my writing. And I had to find ways to try to document this connection between what Woodson was doing and Black teachers more broadly, right, across state lines. Well, the Records of Colored Teachers Association became one of the first places for me to kind of test that theory. And so I sought out the publications, the journals of colored teacher associations to try to look in the months of January, February, and March to see coverage of Negro History Week, or to see if Woodson showed up in any particular way. And sure enough, I was able to very easily locate and trace Woodson's national kind of partnership with Black teachers. And that simple task and exercise from me and my own historical research helped me realize why the records and the publications of those organizations were so important. But in seeking them out, I also came to realize how scattered those materials were. Many of them were in unprocessed collections. Oftentimes, in order to get access to them, it had to do with who you knew that might be able to point you in the direction of where to locate them. Some of them I found in unprocessed collections that were just kind of in boxes. Vanessa Siddle Walker does an important work telling this story when she talks about the origins of the lost education of Horace Tate. But you can just take that story from Georgia and it looks similar, and in some cases, even worse scenarios in other states. When we look at the way that these teacher associations were forced to merge with the kind of white teacher organizations. And in what came after, we know that a lot of these educators were fired, their institutions, their pedagogical knowledge was completely undermined. And so the Black Teacher Archive is a project that myself and Professor Imani Perry, who's currently at Princeton, we've been doing the past couple of years to locate these materials, digitize them, and to create an online portal that will house these materials. And of course, this is work that's informed by the very clear scholarship of folks like, Professor Anderson and Professor Siddle Walker, who have demonstrated why these organizations were so important, and that there's a lot that we have to learn about the organizing tradition, the specific kind of activism that Black teachers engaged in that was distinct based on their particular needs as a group of professionals. And a very important part of Black civil rights history is tied to these organizations, right? Black teachers were the largest professional body when we think about African-American professionals, right? And they played a very important role in supporting Black institutions, sustaining them financially, but also in terms of sustaining them in the local context. And so we can't fully understand Black political and intellectual history without thinking about these important spaces where Black teachers congregated and came together to do a very important, deep intellectual work. One of the things I was thinking when I was listening to Professor Anderson talk earlier, when I hear him talk about the creation, right? When we talk about learning the words to lift every voice and sing, it's important to note that James Weldon Johnson, right, was the president of the Florida State Teachers Association, right? These Black intellectuals who wrote all the books, all the scholarship that we reclaimed and talk about as the foundation of Black studies were scholars who were a part of these institutional networks and who were part of the leadership of these institutional networks as well, and who were the product of the intellectual and kind of and political organizing that took place in those spaces. So that's what those journals represent. That's what those organizations represent. And there's a lot that we can that we need to learn from those materials that exist. And so that's what the Black Teacher Archive project is setting out to do.
Okay, given all the time in the world, I'd love to have a conversation about what do we lose when we no longer have those kinds of organizations, right? And I think they are coming back. I see more and more Black and brown young people, young teachers organizing themselves. But nothing like the kind of coverage that we would have had 50 years ago. I'm gonna put that question on the side though, because I know there are a lot of really important questions in the chat, and I have a couple others here on the side. Nakifa, do you want to start with the questions in the chat? Have you been monitoring them?
I have. Okay, so we have quite a few, and I'll just choose the first one I see here. As Black men steeped in liberation pedagogy and liberation scholarship, how do you survive, thrive, exist, coexist in predominantly white academic institutions?
That's a very, very important and insightful question. I've been trying to keep up with some of this because, and again, the more we're disenfranchised, the more they will feel bold and arrogant to harm us in these institutions. I recall there was a Black principal in Texas, and after George Floyd was murdered, he simply sent an email, and all he said was, systemic racism is alive and well. That shouldn't be controversial. And he was fired for that. There was a teacher in Missouri that used the book Martin, where a young Black child was racially profiled. She was fired for that. She was on the brink of becoming tenured. She had 3 years in. She was fired for that. We're going to see these institutional responses where people feel empowered and bold to do things they otherwise wouldn't do because they know you don't have a comeback. If you're disenfranchised, you really don't have a comeback. And so you're going to see a lot more of this aggressive behavior. Look at the legislation to outlaw critical race theory. Look at the legislation which say that they don't use the word, but they're really telling everyone, and particularly Black teachers, that you can't teach anything that makes white kids feel uncomfortable. You know, now again, it's like the voter registration in the 60s. All of these years, were they ever worried about Black students being uncomfortable? You know, on the racism, on the segregation. And then they say you can't teach anything that's divisive. By whose judgment is it divisive? So we're seeing these changes, and they're seeing them passed into law. And given governors and lieutenant governors and prosecutors and local school districts, I mean, the governor in Virginia created a hotline for people to call into in case they saw or heard that a teacher was teaching something that they deemed to be uncomfortable or divisive. And so that's where we are now. And so this is a very good question. The answer, of course, is, you know, how do we organize to counter this? How do Black teachers protect themselves in this environment? How do political, I just think that given a limited time where there is some control in the House, that the Black caucus, they should have hearings on this. They should bring people before the nation on this and raise this as an issue, and to think about what kind of federal act do we need to protect, literally protecting the freedom of speech and the freedom of assembly. As a teacher in a classroom, so what, if we teach James Weldon Johnson poems or Paul Laurence Dunbar's poem, if we talk about things that happened to Emmett Till, is that going to make someone feel uncomfortable? Is that going to be perceived as divisive? You're telling us that you can no longer teach your history. You can't teach your history because your history makes me uncomfortable. Shut it down. And so it's a very good question. It shouldn't stop as a question. We should stop. We should be thinking in so many ways how to be active to counter this movement, because it's not just isolated. You know, so many states, so many laws that are being passed to shut people down.
Yeah, I appreciate the question as well. And for me, I think thus far, it's been important for me to constantly remind myself that the work that I'm doing as a scholar and as an intellectual is not bound by the kind of walls of the institution that, where I currently work, right? And that in the relationship that I have to the work is it's it's not just a kind of intellectual exercise, but it's also something that's coming from very personal questions that I have based on the communities that I'm connected to, where I come from, my own people, right? And so I have to make sure that I keep myself grounded by being a part of institutions that prioritize the work in the way that I understand it to be important, as more than just an intellectual exercise, right? So, President Payne mentioned the fact that I'm on the executive council for ASALH, right? For me, when I was writing about this history of Woodson and Black teachers, and the fact that we only have ASALH because Black teachers sustained the organization through the Great Depression and up and through the years, right? I found that it was important for me to help to kind of do the work to maintain those sorts of institutions that continue, that obviously have an important role to serve in the current moment, especially when we just think about all that Professor Anderson shared about attacks on the teaching of race and the history of racial inequality in the context of schools, right? ASALH and that organization was created by Black folks. It was one of the few Black organizations that still exists, and that actually has a very intimate relationship to the history of Black teachers. The other part is about being in community with other scholars who I understand to have the same shared values and a shared relationship to the work that continue to make me feel inspired and to remind me about why what we do as academics is about more than just writing books and writing articles, but it's both about preserving the traditions that I benefited from, that we benefited from, but also to kind of attend to the kind of records and the traditions that we have that can be resources for us in the contemporary moment. And learning and studying these institutions, these tools, these resources that Black folks created that were not given to them, I find to be extremely inspiring and helpful, that I know that there are things that we can do that are within our power, and that we have the agency to kind of pick up to navigate the hostility of the kind of current moment, but also to imagine alternative ways of being in relationship with the world than what we currently see before us, right? That's the tradition that I see embodied in the kind of history of fugitive pedagogy that I write about. These teachers that are seeking out and working to enact something in their pedagogy that they had no evidence in the world around them that it was possible to kind of create, right? But all of this stuff about the creating universal public education, all of this stuff about creating Negro History Week, writing alternative curriculums, right? For teachers to use in schools. These were people that were imagining and trying to think otherwise and figuring out how to put it into practice and how to embody it in the way that they showed up in their dispositions as teachers. And that for me is how I exist, right? And coexist in a place that's hostile, is because I know that I'm in, but not of this particular place that might be hostile to me. And that I know that there's a longer tradition that I have to borrow from and to build on, and that I also need to be accountable to as well.
Whoever said that's a great question was right. I mean, for me, should I be on a white campus or a Black campus? There's that question. But shall I be teaching at the college level, or shall I be teaching K-12, right? You can make an argument that if I really wanted to make a social impact, I'd be elsewhere, right? In the end, I don't think the space that you're in matters that much. It certainly doesn't matter as much as your own clarity about your own values. In the middle 1970s, when I was finishing the late 1970s, when I was finishing my graduate work at Northwestern, I don't know, there must have been 4 or 5 of us. I think one of them might be on this call right now, who went to Black institutions. At least 3 of us went to Southern University. A couple went to Jackson State. I think a couple went to Texas Southern. We had different kinds of experiences. But for some of us, we found as much Black space is not always liberated space, to put it mildly. Right? I find as much Uncle Tomism. In fact, there's a book called Uncle Tom's Campus, which has its problems, but there's some truth in it, right? And for me, it's Southern, and I love Southern. My first year there, I thought, well, this is what I'm doing for the rest of my life. I retired from this place. It was just wonderful for all the reasons that Jim just gave you. Unless you had an opinion that the administration didn't like. There was no such thing as free speech. The deans, when I first got there, thought that they should approve your syllabi. I just thought that was insane, right? So it could be a controlling, intimidated, status-absorbed separated from their own communities to some degree, at least in terms of their own mind, thinking they're better than the people who are off campus. The problems don't disappear when you go into Black space, right? They take a different form. There's no place in this society that is free of racism and its consequences, right? At the same time, well, I would just leave it there, right? No place is free of the racism. You have to be clear, try to be clear about your own values and what's the best contribution that you can make, right? Given your own priorities. I will say this last thing about that cohort of folk I went to grad school with. Some of us used to say at the time that our choices as young Black professionals was to go to white schools and feel alienated, or go to Black schools and feel frustrated, right? That there was sort of no place where we're going to fit in completely.
And in many ways, I mean, that's also an important part of this historical narrative as well, right? I think, you know, Jelani Favor's book, Shelter in the Time of Storm, is important context for this, where he talks about the importance of HBCUs as there's no way to undermine or to kind of write off the importance of Black people gathering in the context of HBCUs, even when the interests of the students and many of the professors at times as well were at odds with some of the conservative boards that had control of some of these schools, right? When we think about someone like, I was doing a talk recently in St. Clair Drake, right, who talks about his Black teachers and exposing him to Black history in Stoughton, Virginia. But then when he goes to Hampton, him and the Black students in the 1920s, they're leading a campus protest demanding for more Black professors and more Black administrators at an HBCU, right? A couple of years before that, Carter G. Woodson is a professor at Howard University, where he introduces the very first courses in Negro history in the history department, right? When he gets there in 1919, and then he leaves after the spring of 1920. But because of his conflicts with the white president of the university, right, his time at Howard is very short-lived, right? And so there's a very important this is where this is where Professor Anderson's work became really important, when he talked about the struggle for ideological hegemony, when we have to think about the complexity of institutions and how you have multiple competing ideas that are being negotiated in the context of these spaces. And that applies to most institutions, quite broadly, but especially when we think about the history of Black education and the relationship between funding and school leadership and all these different dynamics that Black students and teachers are navigating. It forces us to have to be a bit more nimble in our thinking when we're thinking about what constitutes activism, what constitutes meaningful education in these contexts, and also how do we imagine how Black people are navigating these very complex spaces, across these time periods, really, right? I can think about even when I was learning about the history at Alabama State, when Harper Council Trenholm had to expel a number of the students who were participating in the student movement because it was demanded that he do so by the government. But then learning that he helped a number of these students find places to be enrolled at other historically Black colleges in other states, right, was very important to think about the kind of complex terrain that many of these kind of Black college presidents were working under, but similarly Black teachers, how they were negotiating these constraints and how they were working to kind of engage in what they understood to be a meaningful politics despite those constraints as well. I feel like it's just important to name that.
Nakifa?
Yes. Do we have time for one more question?
Absolutely.
Okay,
A couple
so
more.
here we go. We will take one from Yolanda Green. The more I think about it, the more I believe that some of us still engage in the fugitive pedagogy in our classroom schools in 2022. Would you agree with that? And if so, would you please expound on that thought?
And Jarvis, would you say a little bit about what fugitive pedagogy means to you before you?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, as I mentioned earlier, when I was writing my dissertation in grad school, it was just about this intellectual history of Black teachers. I wanted to learn more about, what it meant to think about Black teachers as more than just practitioners, but also as scholars. And these textbooks that Carter G. Woodson wrote, but then also teachers before him, like Lila Amos Pendleton, John Cromwell, right? Edward Johnson, who also were educators and wrote textbooks. But it wasn't until at the very end of my graduate school process, when I was putting closure on my dissertation and about to kind of leave and go start a postdoc, that I came across this narrative about a teacher named Tessie McGee in Webster Parish, Louisiana, who, one of her former students told this narrative multiple times about how she would secretly read from Carter G. Woodson's textbooks in the early 1930s in her classroom at the Webster Parish Training School. The student recalls an instance when someone walks in the classroom and she stops teaching from the textbook, and then she would begin teaching from the required outline. Then the student said when the person left, her eyes went back to the book in her lap. That particular narrative, right, became very important for me, not only because the textbook was there representing this kind of counter-intellectual tradition, but that story from that student, right? And we heard a lot of these kinds of stories when we think about all the stories that we shared about some of our teachers, but exposed me to the social history that I had to account for in order to even make sense of a lot of the intellectual questions I wanted to think about when it came to Black teachers, right? The teacher's act of secretly reading from the textbook and the way that she was negotiating power within the constraints of this training school in the rural part of Louisiana was just as instructive to that student watching her as the lesson that she was reading to them from the textbook, right? And so fugitive pedagogy for me became a way of naming this through line that I wanted to talk about in the history of Black education that began prior to Jim Crow, right? But that began with the subversive politics of Black people during enslavement who defied anti-literacy laws, right? To steal away at night, to climb into pits in the ground to have school, right? To create these kind of clandestine schools, in places like Savannah and in various places across the South. I saw those subversive politics of Black folks during the period of enslavement as connected to the work of teachers like Tessie McGee, who was continued to negotiate constraints even as Black education was no longer illegal, but still continued to be met with violent white resistance, right? This is something that we see up and through the kind of, the late 19th century, even into the early 20th century, right? I think of a narrative of a teacher in Virginia in 1905 who's teaching about the Reconstruction period, having lived through it, right? And he's speaking back to the textbook, and he writes about the kind of white superintendent or local school administrator walking into his classroom who was a former Confederate soldier, and catches him mid-sentence when he's talking about Black leadership and the importance of the right of voting during the Reconstruction era, right? 2 weeks later, he's fired, right? I already shared that narrative about Carter G. Woodson's cousin being fired from the high school. So what I'm saying is that even as Black education became legal, Black people continue to have to navigate the realities of violent white resistance. And a lot of important aspects of Black education took place beyond the kind of public eye, right? And I wanted to account for that and to name that explicitly. And so fugitive pedagogy is my way of naming that, by both talking about the tradition of fugitive slaves like Frederick Douglass, who represents the origins of the Black educational tradition, right? Not only because they wrote the very first text that would be the literary foundation of the Black intellectual tradition, but also because the lives of people like, Frederick Douglass and so many other fugitive slaves, we see this connection between education and freedom being conceptualized in their writing, but also in their lives and in their practice, right? And I see that as connected to the work of teachers like that teacher I shared about, Tessie McGee, but also Carter G. Woodson and so many other educators who were navigating this complex terrain. But the language of fugitive pedagogy names both the constraints and the way African-American people found sophisticated ways to navigate power, right? To pursue a more meaningful, more liberatory model of education despite those constraints.
Nikifa, if you're looking for it, I think Ahmad has a question.
Yes. So thank you for those wonderful answers. The next question is, how do we or I coexist with Black teachers who are colonized and uphold white supremacy in their practice of teaching Black children? How do I or we interrupt the harm these Black colonized teachers do to Black students?
Jarvis, you want to take a shot at it?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that I think is this is going back to part of the question that part of the comment I think that Professor Payne raised earlier as well about that it's important to note that there's always been a kind of range when it comes to Black teachers, right? Just as the same way we have a kind of a range when it comes to the ideological spectrum, when it comes to the actual, the skills of educators as well, right? That there's always been this kind of complexity. I think Carter G. Woodson in The Miseducation of the Negro, I think really is one of the early texts where he names this kind of tension that exists in the context of schooling, where some of the harm that we see happening in the context of education, we have to be mindful about the ways in which we ourselves can become agents in reproducing that harm and that violence within our communities, right? But one of the things that I would say is that this is why it's important to kind of think and name the very important intellectual work that all teachers have to engage in, especially Black teachers, right? It's not simply enough just to be a Black teacher in front of Black students, right? It also has to do with, what are the traditions and what is your orientation to the work of being an educator that we also have to interrogate. And I think that our conversations about, recruiting and retaining more Black teachers also has to become more complex, right? Because I think a lot of people make assumptions about who these Black teachers are that we're interested in recruiting and retaining. And there's a way in which Black teachers, just like any other teacher, can reproduce and do harm in the context of schools. One of the things that I think is important that we learn from the historical record is that one of the things that why these Black teacher associations were so important is because those spaces became very important institutions for working to model the best of what it meant to be a Black teacher, to establish a professional standard that was set apart from the mainstream kind of models of what it meant to be a teacher, right? You have Black teachers that were insisting that they build with the kind of emerging scholarship and intellectual ideas that was on the cutting edge that Black scholars were producing, that were helping them to think differently about matters, whether it pertains to, we could think even in like the 1920s, the way some Black teachers are starting to think differently about their relationship to the continent of Africa with the emergence of a lot of African history by Black scholars, right? And people like Carter G. Woodson translating that information for Black educators to interrogate and to reimagine, not just the curriculum, but how they themselves understood their own identities, right? And so I think that's one of the things, is that we have to think about, where are the spaces where Black teachers get access to not just the kind of traditions, but the space to interrogate the very substance and meaning about what it actually means to be a Black teacher. And I think that's a start to get at some of those questions and concerns about educators who are reproducing harm in the context of schools, is we have to really name the intellectual demands of what it means to be a teacher, and particularly a Black teacher, and cultivate that orientation to the work for educators, right? And it's more than just, I would be interested to know about how we understand what constitutes a colonized Black teacher, because I think that there's ways in which harm can be reproduced, both in a kind of Afrocentric model of education, the same way that there's a way that harm can be produced in a kind of very traditional, what would be read as kind of mainstream model of education. And I think this is why it's important to have spaces where Black teachers can come together and engage in those deep intellectual questions and intellectual struggle.
And I would add, and this is something that, because Charles knows, Professor Payne, who studied organizing the social movements, the thing that I take from social movements and from my own county and from other incidents is that it's a dynamic process. Where people stand today does not dictate where they will stand tomorrow. And one of the things I recall was that at one point, right around 1965 or so, after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the farmers in Greene County, where I grew up, registered to vote. And when they registered, most of them were sharecroppers and tenant farmers, and the response of the white power structure was simply to put them off their land, clean sweep. And they built what was called Tent City. I remember going down and helping to build those tents. And these were proud people who had their families in tents on mud floors. And the day that I went to help build, it had rained and it was muddy. But when they made that move to give up everything, land, income, all that they had saved to become registered to vote, it changed everything. People who had been on the fence, people who might have been unsure or even against it, you could see rallying. And this was like in 1965. In 1968, the county was all Black in terms of its county board of education, the probate sheriff, the probate judge, the sheriff, the elections. People had rallied because what they managed to do was kind of like George Floyd. You think about all the murders before George Floyd, right? Trayvon and Tamar, there were series before George Floyd. But the way that one occurred, and the young woman who used her iPhone to film it, just changed the nation in some ways. I mean, people are trying to backtrack from that in so many ways, but Congress changed, institutions changed. You know, Black Lives Matter was transformed and looked at in a different way. People finally understood the message that they had been delivering for a long time. And so what I would say to that question is, don't think so much about where people stand today. Think about what we can do to shape where they will stand tomorrow.
Great place to leave that. I'm going to try to say three things quickly. Much of my life, I'm trying to understand how you make urban schools better, how you make urban school systems better. And for the most part, I'm pretty convinced that the biggest stumbling block is just teacher attitude, adult attitude, right? They don't believe in the kids. They don't believe these kids can function at a high level, right? And getting through that, if I can get through that, the rest of the issues in those schools, the rest of the issues that I think we can solve. And some of the folk with the nastiest attitudes are Black or brown. Now, I'm of the 1960 generation, so we grew up saying we want Black faces in every place, right? And we grew up fighting for Black teachers, fighting for Black principals. And so that's natural and that's good, and that's the right struggle for that moment. As the struggle that I see developing in New Jersey, that I hope to see developing in New Jersey, in the next step of this discussion, some of us have to be blunt about the fact that some of the people who failed children are Black and brown and in high places. And that's a hard thing. We got a lot of history that makes it hard for us to criticize ourselves in that way, right? I think we're at a point now where we have to do it. I would still like to end though with what Jim said. You know, the folk from the Algebra Project, the folk who were, on the last panel, if we had thought to ask them, they could have given you all kinds of examples of teachers who used to be colonized, who working with a group. What Jarvis said about not letting teachers be isolated is just very, very important. But they could give you examples from the work they've done with teachers in schools, of teachers of all colors, who start off saying, you can't teach these kids that way. These kids can't pass that course. They start off that way and come out believing these kids can do what anybody else can do, right? People can change with support. And I always believed, I came away from that experience believing that while negative Black teachers could be even nastier than white teachers at the beginning of the process, because they would say some things white people would be afraid to say. It was actually easier to change Black people because their lack of faith was kind of defensive, right? They really did want to believe. And if you could get them started, you can move them easier. I have no idea whether that's really true, but I wanted to believe that. But the important thing, I think, is to where people are now is not where they have to be, right? And we can move from them. Let's try to take one more at least, Nikifa.
Yes. So our last question for today is actually related to fugitive pedagogy. So going back to that, is education inherently fugitive as it is inherently political?
Well, I agree with the premise that education is inherently political, but as I'm understanding the kind of language of fugitivity that's kind of emerging from African-American literature, African-American history. It's emerging from the kind of counter historical tradition of, fugitive slaves, right? Who are choosing to kind of think and offer a kind of new basis of knowledge of what it means to think about the kind of society that we live in, right? Who's even kind of offering a kind of a fugitive perspective on what constitutes justice, right? When they're doing things like engaging in what's considered criminal activity by engaging in an education, right? But they understand the kind of laws that restrict their access to education to be illegitimate, right? So what I don't want to say that all education is inherently fugitive, because I think that would, dilute this tradition that I'm trying to write about that emerges from the fugitive literacy practices of enslaved people that I'm naming as the foundation of an educational tradition that Black people would then work to expand on and put into practice when we start thinking about these kind of equitable visions of kind of justice enacted with the kind of Reconstruction statutes that kind of made universal education more widely available. When we think about the counter curricular narratives that Black teachers are developing, where they're writing about, fugitive slaves and the Haitian Revolution as an important part of not just their history, but of human history, right? That's the tradition of fugitive pedagogy that I'm writing about. And that's a very clearly counter hegemonic, right? Even as this upholding the status quo is also a political kind of way of that's still political. That's still doing political work. If you're a teacher, not teaching against the grain and just doing, the work to kind of maintain the traditional protocols of schooling, right? But that's not in the tradition that I'm writing about when I'm thinking about these Black teachers and the traditions that they're building on and putting into practice, right? So while all education is political, I would not say that it's all fugitive based on the way that I'm understanding that term, that is grounded and accountable to the history of fugitive slaves and fugitive literacy, and the way that Black teachers reclaimed the history of people like Frederick Douglass, right? I talked about Carter G. Woodson attending the Frederick Douglass School, my high school English teacher attending the Frederick Douglass School in Hot Springs, Arkansas. But also when you look at those textbooks and the way that Black teachers were writing about Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, and the way that they were engaging in that way of teaching against the grain, right? It's a very distinct tradition. And I wouldn't want to just take that language and just cast it broadly, because I think it would do a disservice to the tradition that we have, that we should understand as distinct and as important in that way.
There was one, Jim, did you want to add anything to
that? I agree. I think the simple answer is no, because we're talking about intergenerational traditions that are passed on from one generation. And in that regard, the Black community is no different than any other community. When you pass on things from one generation to another generation, some people miss it. That is inevitable. I'll take it as an example, something that's not even connected to what we're talking about. The scientific revolution. It bypassed most people. It bypassed most Americans. That's why we got the response to COVID-19 we got.
Right.
People think overnight they can become their own epidemiologists and make this, you have no idea what you're talking about. But we tried to pass on this notion of science and of viability, replication, and so forth, to say this is how you think about things like this, not just health, but you think scientifically. Most people we've learned don't think scientifically, including people like Kyra Ehrman and Aaron Rodgers and others. I mean, there are a lot of high-level people, politicians, who don't think that way. So if you think about fugitive pedagogy in that sense, there is a tradition. It is passed on from generation to generation, but some people miss it. And the challenge is try as much as possible to make sure that everybody gets it, because it's so critical for what we do. And so it is a distinctive framing of a tradition that is passed on. So To the question, I would say no. It's a matter of choices that are made. It's not in the water.
And we don't want to water it down, to use the language that Jarvis used. I am going to read this one last question, and I think it's a question that has already been, at least, it's been touched on several times by both of you, but I will read it in case you want to say anything else. This is really the first question we got from Patrick McQuillan, and hi, Patrick, I hope all is well, who works with teachers, and you can tell that from this question. I would be interested to hear what the implications of this research might be for educational leaders and school teachers. What lessons might educators bring to bear in their school leadership practices and active pedagogies if they draw upon the lessons generated through this research? So that's the question Patrick submitted. And there's a phrase in one of Jarvis's articles in which he ends the article by saying, "We have yet to fully account for the tools African-American teachers of the past left behind for us to pick up, reconfigure, and do battle with in our own time." I mean, that's touching the same idea, right?
Yeah.
And again, both of you have spoken to this already, but is there anything else you want to say about how, who understands this history better than two of you? Anything else you want to say about how understanding that history helps us think better, do better work?
Yeah, I would just take as an example, because it's not going to filter down automatically. The work that we do we take it to the right context, right audience? And Fugitive Pedagogy, Jarvis writes about this moment where Woodson is speaking. 2,500 teachers showed up for the talk. Standing room only, some on the outside. But what it tells us that Woodson was taking his message to the right people, to the right context. Of course, it had a great impact on teachers, but if he had just written these books and stayed at another level, the impact would have been different. 80% of the schools have a Negro History Week. The question, which I would turn in a different way, to what extent do the work that we do, that we actually take it to the right context, to the right community, to the right teachers? Because if we do, then it does have implications for school leaders, for administrators, for teachers. And so that's the thing that we have to keep an eye out for, because we can influence that. We can talk to colleagues. It's like, it's not enough to write, a wonderful book for professional historians, or to write a book, I mean, that is considered to be great by scholars. How much do we take what we learn to the communities that we learn it from?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would say that we can't take for granted like what it means to actively kind of cultivate a professional identity as a teacher that's accountable to a specific tradition of teaching. And one of the things that I've found to be very important, and it's been an important lesson to me since I've been sharing about the work, is that anytime that I've kind of gone and presented on the work in front of a group of educators, one of the biggest things that I've overwhelmingly got is teachers sharing and working through the fact that they knew so little about this historical tradition of Black teachers that they feel inspired by, but also feel ashamed by the fact that they have so little knowledge about, which I think says something about how teachers are, are trained, or what resources they're given or not given when it comes to the professionalization of teachers, right? That they're not given space to think about what it means to actively cultivate a professional identity that's rooted and grounded in a pedagogical tradition, in a tradition of teaching that precedes the current moment, right? So much about what it means to be a teacher has to do with emphasizing the kind of practical procedural aspects of managing the classroom and doing school, that we don't think, the same way we talk about students needing kind of counter narratives for their own identity and for their academic identities. I would say the same thing is important for the cultivation of strong and empowered teacher identities, right? Is that teachers have to be given space to think about themselves as connected to a much longer tradition, and especially Black teachers, right? If we're expecting for Black teachers to show up and do important work, and many Black teachers do have the kind of commitment and this commitment to Black students and to equity in schools, right? Even though they may not necessarily have all of this context, but I do think that having this context is important for their own professional disposition, right? And it's something for them to look back to think about how do they build and kind of expand their own toolkit for how they understand the work that they're doing and how they show up, right? And so I think that that's something that's very important, is that school leaders, administrators need to do that kind of deep intellectual reflection on what it actually means to be a teacher, right? How have Black people been struggling with that important question around the vocation of teaching for a very long period of time, right? James, we can go to someone like Richard Robert Wright in 1896 writing The Possibilities of the Negro Teacher, right? We see this long tradition of Black teachers writing and reflecting on what it means to be a Black teacher and trying to organize and explicitly outline strategies about how to occupy that position, right? In a way that is accountable to the larger project of education for freedom for themselves as individual Black teachers, but also for the students that they're trying to show up for, right? And I think that there's a long intellectual and historical tradition for these educators and school leaders today to look to and to be empowered by. And I think we need to create more space for them to do that intellectual work and to emphasize that being a teacher is more than just being a practitioner. It's fundamentally about a set of intellectual concerns, and the pedagogical question has to do with leaning into the intellectual demands of the work of what it means to be a teacher. You have to be a scholar of the practice, it's not just about doing, it's about thinking and doing. And I think these teachers that we've been talking about historically modeled what it meant to be accountable to the profession in that way.
Okay. I guess we honestly do have to end at some point. So, and I say that because it's such a wonderful discussion, and people in the chat are saying it's a wonderful discussion. So we have to think next year about how we can have longer, deeper discussions. And I think one of the things that I would like, Crystal Clemens Moore is on the line from Children's Research Fund. It'd be wonderful to have a conversation between you guys with your historical knowledge and people like Crystal, who are training teachers now, people like Sharif El-Mekki from Philadelphia, who's running a teacher training center now, and just take this to a different level in that way. Beyond that, in terms of the substance of tonight, I have like two reactions. On the one hand, I forget what, school teacher to the race, a phrase from a book to describe Carter G. Woodson. There's a certain kind of hubris, right? I mean, just nerve to just say, I am going to teach my whole race. I'm going to teach it. And then he goes out and creates organizations and traditions and networks to teach the whole race. Right? It's a different kind of a mindset. Right?
But it was important that, but Woodson didn't come up with that term himself. Those Black teachers wrote about him in that way, right? That was a title that Black teachers, schoolmaster to his race is a title that Black public school teachers, when they wrote about him, that's me borrowing that language from them and reflecting on his influence.
But that's even better for the point I want to make. Because here's the point I want to make. You harp, I think, on the fact that he was taught by slaves, right? And this whole notion, oh, my race needs something, I'm going to create it, right? I really do think that comes from the vision of free people, right? Who are literally looking at the world and saying, this whole thing wasn't made for us, right? And if we want something, we have to create it from scratch, whatever it is, right? And that whole attitude, that world building attitude, it's just remarkable. And it is something, I think, to go back to where James started us, there's something sacred in that attitude, especially when you connect it to raising the next generation. So that's one way to react to all of this. The other way I react to this is just simply, dang, 100 and some years after Woodson starts his project, most Black children, to say nothing of white children, don't get anything like an adequate introduction to African American history. Nothing like it, right? So inspiring on the one hand, and I don't know what the other word is, maybe ashamed that we haven't done more in Woodson tradition on the other. We do have to leave. I think Nakifa has a couple of housekeeping details. I just want to say thank you to all of you for making this such a rich experience. To Jim and Jarvis for sending us out on a really high note, right, with stuff to think about for the rest of the summer. My colleagues here at Rutgers Newark and Urban Education, my colleagues at Newark Public Schools, this stuff wouldn't have gotten launched without their interest in this series of questions. And absolutely my team here at the Cornwall Center, which is really taking a deep ownership over this work that they do on top of everything else that they have to do there. And Nakifa, you had some stuff you wanted to raise before we end?
I just had some closing remarks. Hi, everyone. My name is Nakifa Bernard-Garay, Senior Program Director here at the Cornwall Center at Rutgers Newark. And again, wanted to echo Dr. Payne's remarks of gratitude on behalf of the Freedom School Project, the Newark Urban Education Department at Rutgers, and the Cornwall Center. We want to thank you and everyone that made this event possible. What a historic night. We have two of the nation's preeminent scholars of Black education. Thank you to our panelists, Dean Anderson and Dr. Givens, for thoughtful and inspiring dialogue. Thank you for sharing your stories and your powerful, sacred energy towards the preservation of Black education history, and in turn, the advancement of Black liberation. A thank you to Black teachers, past and present, who work tirelessly to educate our youth within and outside the confines of education, state, federal, and local parameters. And finally, a big thank you to all of you in the audience. This event wouldn't be possible without your support. We hope you continue to tune in to the Freedom School Project programming. As Ahmad mentioned, this is the final project event of the season, pardon. And I'd like to point your attention to the survey link posted in the chat. And if you're interested in getting involved, please take a moment in completing that survey. It's a short Google form. Your response will help inform the next cycle of programming, like tonight's panel and the ones that came before. Thank you for being here, and thank you for supporting the work of the Freedom School Project. Wishing you all a great night.